On my college graduation day, my father said, "You've destroyed every dream I had by existing." He said it right after I walked across the stage with my engineering degree while my mother sat there nodding, and my younger brother recorded it thinking it was funny. I could have been promoted to regional manager 15 years ago, but they said I had to relocate and I couldn't because of you and your school and your needs. He'd never mentioned this promotion before, but suddenly my entire childhood was the reason for his mediocrity. "Dad, I was 7 when I started school. Every kid goes to school." He laughed bitterly. "Not every kid demands special attention. You had to have tutoring. You had to have basketball. You had to have birthday parties. Do you know how much money I wasted on you?" He pulled out a notebook he'd apparently been keeping for 22 years. $342,000 including food, housing, and activities. That could have been my retirement fund, my boat, my life. He'd calculated what I cost down to the penny, including what he called oxygen tax for breathing his air. Parents are supposed to provide for their children. He slammed the notebook on the restaurant table, making other graduation families stare. "I didn't want children. Your mother trapped me, got pregnant on purpose. Then you arrived and suddenly my whole life was about you." My mother finally spoke. "He's right. He wanted me to terminate, but I thought a baby would make him happy. Instead, you made him miserable." They'd been planning this ambush at my graduation dinner. "You cried every night for 6 months. I couldn't sleep. Lost my job at the bank because I was exhausted. Had to take a lower paying position. That's $30,000 a year lost over 20 years. $600,000 you cost me in career damage." He was adding imaginary numbers now. "Then you had to get sick at 8. Appendicitis, hospital bills, missing work." Another promotion lost to Jackson, who didn't have a parasite draining his life. Jackson had gotten promoted because he had a degree my father didn't. "You chose to have me. I didn't ask to be born." My father stood up, pointing at me. "Exactly. You're a burden I never requested. A financial drain I never approved. A life destroyer I was tricked into supporting." My brother Kyle was still recording and laughing. "Tell her about the house, Dad." My father smiled. "Right, we could have bought the nice house in Riverside, but no, had to stay in the bad neighborhood because of your school district. That house is worth $2 million now. You cost me $2 million in property appreciation. We'd lived in a perfectly nice middle-class neighborhood. You had to go to college. 4 years of tuition. You could have worked straight out of high school, but you're selfish. Wanted education. Wanted to better yourself at my expense. I'd gotten a full scholarship and worked 3 jobs, but that didn't fit his narrative. I paid for everything myself, Dad." He laughed. "Who drove you to campus tours? Who paid for gas? Who bought your high school textbooks that prepared you for scholarships? All me. You owe everything to me and gave nothing back." My mother added, "You never even offered to drop out and work to support us. Real daughters would sacrifice for their parents." I stared at them both. "You wanted me to drop out of high school to support you?" My father nodded. "Would have been the respectful thing. Instead, you stayed in school like a leech. Then college. Now you have a degree and a job offer, and what do we get? Nothing. You're moving across the country, abandoning us after we sacrificed everything. The job offer was my escape plan. You just said I ruined your life by existing. Why would you want me to stay?" He pulled out another paper. "Because you owe us. I've calculated it. With interest, you owe us $700,000 for raising you. We'll take 20% of your salary for life." He'd actually drawn up a payment plan. "That's insane. Parents don't charge their children for raising them." Kyle spoke up. "I'm not paying them back. They can't make me." My father turned on him. "You're different. You're wanted. You're the son I actually planned for." Kyle had been born 2 years after me when my father thought a son would be better. "So I owe you money for existing, but Kyle doesn't?" My mother explained. "Kyle has potential. You're just a female who'll get married and have babies. Your engineering degree is worthless. You'll quit within a year to be a housewife. Waste of our investment." I stood up to leave. "I'm done. Don't contact me again." My father grabbed my wrist. "You don't get to leave. I own you. I created you. I fed you. You're my property until you pay me back." I pulled away. "Touch me again and I'll call the police." He laughed. "For what? A father wanting compensation for 22 years of hell?" The restaurant manager approached. "Is everything okay here?" My father smiled. "Just an ungrateful daughter refusing to pay her debts." The manager looked at me. "Do you need help?" I nodded and he escorted me out while my father screamed about calling the police for theft of services. I moved across the country the next week. Changed my phone number. Didn't tell them my address. 6 months later, my aunt called. My father had been telling everyone I'd abandoned them after stealing money. Then he tried to take out loans in my name, saying I'd authorize them as repayment. I spent the first week in my new apartment jumping at every knock on the door. The delivery guy with my internet router made me freeze mid-step, and when my neighbor came by with a welcome basket, I almost didn't answer. I checked the locks 3 times before bed and once in the middle of the night when a car door slammed outside. My hands still shook when I thought about my father's grip on my wrist at the restaurant, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks that took days to fade. He'd said he owned me, that I was his property, and some stupid part of my brain kept expecting him to show up and drag me back. The apartment was small, just a 1-bedroom with a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, But it was mine, and nobody here knew where I came from or what I'd escaped. I unpacked slowly, putting each item away like I was building a wall between my old life and this new one. Every plate in the cabinet, every book on the shelf, every towel in the bathroom was proof that I'd made it out. Work became my sanctuary because nobody there knew about my family situation. I could pretend to be a normal 22-year-old engineer starting her career, just another new hire learning the company systems and trying to make a good impression. I showed up an hour early every morning and stayed until the cleaning crew started making rounds, partly because I loved the work, and partly because my empty apartment gave me too much time to think. My cubicle was in a row of identical cubicles, gray fabric walls, and a desk with a computer that took forever to boot up, but it felt safe in a way my childhood home never had. My coworker Amelia noticed I was always the first to arrive and last to leave. She stopped by my desk one afternoon during the third week and asked if I wanted to grab lunch in the cafeteria. I almost said no because eating alone meant I could work through lunch and avoid small talk, but something about her smile made me agree. She had dark curly hair pulled back in a ponytail and wore these bright scarves that made her easy to spot across the office. Amelia and I bonded over terrible cafeteria coffee that tasted like it had been sitting in the pot since morning. She talked about her weekend helping her brother move apartments and complained about her overbearing aunt who kept calling to ask why she wasn't married yet. When she mentioned family stuff, I carefully shared that I wasn't in contact with my family without going into details. I said something vague about it being complicated and changed the subject to ask about her engineering projects. She didn't push for more information, just nodded and said her door was always open if I needed to talk. That simple offer, no questions asked, no judgment in her voice, made me feel the first flicker of friendship I'd had in months. We started eating lunch together most days after that, and she introduced me to other people on our team. I learned to laugh at the office jokes and participate in conversations about weekend plans, building this normal life piece by piece. 3 weeks into my new job, I finally started sleeping through the night. The constant fear that my father would somehow find me began to fade into background noise instead of the screaming alarm it had been. I'd changed my phone number before leaving, blocking my parents and Kyle on every platform I could think of. My address wasn't listed anywhere public, and I'd been careful not to mention the city name in any social media posts from before I deleted my accounts. The barrier between my old life and new one felt solid, like I'd actually managed to escape. I stopped checking the locks obsessively and started believing that maybe I was safe here, that the distance and precautions were enough. I even went grocery shopping without constantly looking over my shoulder, just a normal person buying cereal and milk, and those frozen dinners that weren't great, but were easy after long work days. My aunt called my work number on a Tuesday afternoon and ice shot through my veins when the receptionist transferred the call. I never gave anyone that information. My aunt's voice came through the phone, worried and a little scared. She said my father had been telling the whole extended family that I'd abandoned them after stealing money, that I'd taken thousands of dollars and disappeared without a word. People were asking if they should report me to police. My cousin had apparently called her wondering if she should file a missing person report because my parents claimed I'd vanished. My aunt wanted to know if I was okay and what really happened because the story didn't make sense. I explained the truth about the graduation dinner, my voice shaking as I described how my father pulled out his 22-year notebook of calculations. I told her about the $700,000 debt he claimed I owed, about him grabbing my wrist and saying he owned me, about my mother sitting there nodding while Kyle recorded it thinking it was funny. The words tumbled out faster as I went, all the details I'd been holding inside for weeks. My aunt was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she admitted she always thought my father was difficult, that family gatherings were tense when he showed up, but she never realized it was this bad. She believed me because my story made sense of years of odd family stuff, like how he'd get angry if anyone congratulated me on achievements, or how he'd calculate the cost of family dinners down to who ate what. My aunt warned me that my father had been talking about me constantly, showing people his notebooks and calculations. He'd built this whole story where I was the villain who destroyed the family, where everything wrong in his life traced back to me existing. She said people were starting to get uncomfortable because his intensity was frightening. He'd corner relatives at gatherings and go through page after page of expenses, his voice getting louder as he explained how I'd cost him promotions and houses and his whole future. Even family members who initially believed his version were backing away, because he seemed so focused on getting justice and making me pay what I supposedly owed. My aunt said she was calling to warn me to be careful because she'd never seen him this worked up about anything. I thanked my aunt for the warning and asked her not to share any information about me with my parents. I explained I needed complete separation for my safety, that any contact would just give my father more ways to reach me. She agreed and promised she wouldn't tell them anything. But then she mentioned my father had been asking her detailed questions about identity theft, about whether parents could take legal action against adult children for unpaid debts, about how credit worked, and if someone could take out loans in another person's name. My stomach dropped as she listed his questions. She said she'd thought he was just venting at first, but the specific legal questions made her nervous enough to call me. That night I couldn't sleep, replaying my father's words about me owing him $700,000. His insistence that I was his property kept looping in my head, along with those questions about identity theft my aunt mentioned. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling until 3 in the morning, then gave up and made coffee. The next morning at work, I was exhausted and jumpy, and Amelia noticed immediately. She pulled me into an empty conference room during lunch and asked what was wrong. I told her everything, the whole story spilling out in a rush, about the graduation dinner and my father's notebooks and the identity theft questions. When I finished, Amelia didn't hesitate. She said her father, Raymond, was a retired police officer who dealt with family abuse cases for years, and she'd have him talk to me if I wanted. Raymond met me for coffee after work at a place near the office. He was in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes that reminded me of Amelia. I explained the graduation confrontation and my aunt's warning, trying to stay calm but hearing my voice shake anyway. Raymond listened carefully, asking specific questions about my father's behavior and the timeline of events. When I finished, he said my father's actions fit classic financial abuse patterns. The obsessive record-keeping, the impossible debt calculations, the physical grab and ownership claims, all of it matched cases he'd seen before. Then he said the questions about identity theft were serious red flags. Parents who asked those specific questions often followed through, and I needed to check my credit immediately because my father might try to open accounts or take loans in my name. I got home and opened my laptop, typing in the credit monitoring website Raymond had mentioned. My hands shook as I created an account and waited for the page to load. The screen filled with information and I scrolled down, my stomach twisting with each line. 3 credit card applications appeared from the past 2 weeks, all showing my name and social security number but addresses I didn't recognize. All 3 were denied because the addresses didn't match my records. Then I saw it. A personal loan approval for $15,000 dated 5 days ago. My name, my social security number, his address. The status showed disbursed, meaning the money was already gone to an account I had no access to. I stared at the screen until the words blurred together, then grabbed my phone. Raymond answered on the second ring, even though it was after 9 at night. I tried to explain what I'd found, but my voice kept breaking. He told me to breathe and walk him through exactly what the credit report showed. I read him every detail about the denied applications and the approved loan while he stayed quiet and listened. When I finished, he said this was serious fraud, and I needed to file a police report first thing in the morning. He explained that my father had committed identity theft and fraud, that using my information without permission to get money was a crime regardless of family relationships. He said I needed to act fast to protect myself and create a legal record of what my father had done. His calm voice helped me focus enough to write down the steps he outlined. Call the police, bring all documentation, file a formal report, contact the credit bureaus. He said he'd drive me to the station in the morning and help me through the process. I hung up and sat on my couch staring at nothing, trying to process that my father had actually done it. He'd taken out a loan in my name, $15,000. The money was gone and I was legally responsible for debt I never agreed to. My phone buzzed with a text from Amelia asking if I was okay. I called her instead of texting back and everything spilled out. She said she was coming over right now and to unlock my door. 20 minutes later, she arrived with her laptop and a determined expression. She sat next to me on the couch and opened a blank document. We needed to write everything down while it was fresh, she said. Every detail from childhood through the graduation dinner to tonight's discovery. She asked questions and typed while I talked, organizing the information into a timeline that made the pattern of abuse visible in a way I'd never seen before. We printed the loan documents from the credit report, and she helped me gather every piece of evidence I had. Text messages from my aunt, emails I'd saved, the notebook photo Kyle had posted then deleted from the graduation dinner. By 2 in the morning, we had a folder full of documentation, and I felt slightly less powerless. Amelia made me promise to try to sleep and said she'd check on me in the morning. After she left, I lay in bed with my eyes open, replaying every interaction with my father where he'd asked about my social security number, or my address, or my birthday. He'd been collecting information for years, probably since I was a child, waiting for the right moment to use it. I must have fallen asleep eventually because my alarm went off at 7 and I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. I called my supervisor, Charlotte, and told her I had a family emergency and needed the day off. She said to take whatever time I needed and not to worry about work. Raymond picked me up at 8:30 and drove me to the police station downtown. The building was gray and official, and I felt small walking through the doors. Raymond asked for someone who handled fraud cases, and we waited in plastic chairs until a detective called my name. Jace Hensley was maybe 40 with dark hair and tired eyes that looked like they'd seen everything. He led us to a small room with a table and recording equipment and asked me to start from the beginning. I explained about the graduation dinner and my father's notebooks, and his claim that I owed him $700,000. Hensley's expression didn't change, but he wrote everything down. When I got to the part about my father grabbing my wrist and saying he owned me, Hensley looked up and asked if I felt physically threatened. I said yes, and explained how I'd moved across the country to escape. Then I told him about the identity theft, and showed him the credit report printouts. Hensley studied the documents carefully and said this case had clear malicious intent beyond typical family financial disputes. He explained that my father using my information without consent to obtain money was identity theft and fraud no matter what our relationship was. The family connection actually made it worse legally because it showed planning and abuse of trust. He said he'd contact the loan company immediately to flag the fraud and start an investigation. I spent the next 3 hours answering questions and providing every piece of documentation Amelia and I had compiled. Hensley asked about my father's behavior patterns, his threats, his obsessive record-keeping. He wanted to know if my father had access to any of my financial accounts or personal documents. I explained I'd separated everything when I moved, but he must have kept information from when I was younger. Hensley said that was common in family fraud cases. Parents had years of access to their children's personal information, and some kept it specifically for control purposes. By the time we finished, I felt exhausted and exposed, but also strangely powerful. Raymond told me I'd done exactly the right thing as we walked back to his car. My father's behavior would only get worse if nobody stopped it, he said. Legal documentation was my best protection now. That afternoon, Raymond drove me to meet his son Owen at a coffee shop near the financial district. Owen worked as a credit specialist and had already reviewed the documents I'd emailed him. He had his laptop open with multiple credit bureau websites pulled up. He walked me through placing fraud alerts on all 3 major credit bureaus, explaining that this would require extra verification before anyone could open new accounts in my name. Then he helped me initiate a credit freeze, which completely locked down my credit until I personally lifted it with a PIN only I would know. Owen said this meant nobody could open new accounts in my name without additional verification steps that my father wouldn't be able to complete. He showed me how to dispute the fraudulent loan and the denied credit card applications through formal processes with each credit bureau. Owen pulled up my full credit report and went through it line by line, finding 2 more suspicious inquiries from the past month that had been denied. My father had been trying multiple times to open accounts, probably getting more desperate as applications kept getting rejected. Owen helped me write dispute letters to each credit bureau and the loan company, using specific legal language that clearly stated I was a victim of identity theft and had not authorized any of these applications. He said the loan company would have to investigate and likely reverse the charges once they saw the police report and documentation. The denied applications would be removed from my record entirely. He printed copies of everything and organized them in a folder with tabs and dates. Before we left, he set me up with a credit monitoring service that would alert me immediately if anyone tried to use my information again. I went to work the next morning even though I'd barely slept, needing the normalcy of my engineering projects and coworkers who didn't know about my family chaos. During our team meeting, I kept zoning out and missing questions. Charlotte pulled me aside afterward and asked if everything was okay. I apologized and briefly explained I was dealing with some family legal issues that were affecting my focus. Charlotte's expression shifted from concern to determination. She said she was adjusting my project deadlines immediately, and I should take advantage of the company's employee assistance program for counseling. She wrote down the phone number and told me to call them today, that the company paid for sessions and everything was confidential. I thanked her and went back to my desk, staring at the phone number and thinking about how different this support felt from anything I'd experienced growing up. My father had spent 22 years telling me I was a burden and a drain. Charlotte had just offered help without demanding anything in return. I picked up my phone and dialed the employee assistance number, ready to start figuring out how to move forward from here. The employee assistance program answered on the second ring and connected me with someone named Alana Royce, who had an opening that same afternoon. I walked into her office 3 hours later carrying a folder with all my documentation like it might protect me somehow. Alana had gray hair pulled back in a loose bun and an office that smelled like lavender, and she gestured to a comfortable chair across from her desk. I sat down and stared at the folder in my lap, not sure where to start or how to explain 22 years of my father's calculations and control in a 50-minute session. She asked me what brought me in today, and I opened my mouth to give a brief summary. But instead, everything poured out in one long stream about the graduation dinner and the notebooks, and my father grabbing my wrist, and the identity theft, and the loan I never authorized. Saying it all out loud to a stranger made it feel more real somehow, like acknowledging the abuse gave it weight and shape instead of keeping it as this private shame I carried alone. Alana listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes, and when I finally stopped talking, she looked at me with this expression of professional concern, mixed with something like anger on my behalf. She said what I experienced was severe emotional and financial abuse, using those exact clinical terms that made my chest tight, because hearing a professional validate it meant I wasn't overreacting or being dramatic like my parents always claimed. She explained that my father's current behavior with the identity theft and harassment constituted stalking, and the pattern showed escalation that was concerning from a safety perspective. I nodded and felt tears starting, which I tried to blink back because I didn't want to cry in front of someone I'd just met. Alana pushed a tissue box across her desk and said crying was a normal response to trauma, and I'd been holding this in for a very long time. We spent the rest of the session talking about my childhood, and the way my father had always kept track of what I cost him, treating basic parenting expenses like loans I'd need to repay someday. Alana helped me see that my guilt about abandoning my family was a programmed response from years of manipulation, not actual wrongdoing on my part. She said children don't owe parents repayment for basic care like food and housing and school supplies, and my father's calculations were a control tactic designed to keep me trapped in obligation and shame. I'd spent my whole life believing I was this burden who owed everything to parents who sacrificed for me. But Alana explained that parents choose to have children, and choosing to provide care doesn't create a debt. She asked if I'd ever considered that my father's obsession with tracking costs might be his way of justifying his own failures and disappointments by blaming them on me. That thought had never occurred to me before, and it shifted something in my brain like a puzzle piece clicking into place. My father hadn't lost promotions because of me. He'd lost them because he didn't have the qualifications or skills, but blaming me was easier than accepting his own limitations. We scheduled another session for the following week, and I left her office feeling lighter somehow, despite having just relived years of abuse. 2 weeks crawled by while I waited for updates on the fraud investigation, jumping every time my phone rang and checking my email obsessively for news. Detective Hensley finally called on a Tuesday morning while I was at my desk pretending to focus on engineering schematics. He said the loan company had confirmed fraud after reviewing their records, and seeing that the address and contact information didn't match my actual details. They were reversing the loan and removing it from my credit report, but they needed me to sign additional affidavits confirming I hadn't authorized the application or received any of the money. I felt relief wash over me at the news that the fraudulent loan would be erased, but then Hensley added that the loan company had contacted my father as part of their investigation to inform him the loan was reversed due to fraud findings. My stomach dropped because that meant my father now knew I'd reported him to police and involved law enforcement in what he probably saw as a private family matter. Hensley said this was standard procedure in fraud cases, but he wanted me to be aware that my father might react badly to learning about the investigation. I thanked him and hung up, then stared at my computer screen while my hands shook slightly. That same evening, my phone started buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and I let them all go to voicemail without listening to the messages. When I opened my email inbox after dinner, there were already 7 new messages from my father's account, and I felt my heart rate spike as I saw the subject lines. The first email had a subject line that said, "Disappointed," and the message talked about how hurt he was that I'd involved police in a family disagreement, instead of talking to him directly like a mature adult. The second email's subject said, "Betrayal," and accused me of trying to destroy the family by making false fraud claims when I knew I'd authorized him to handle my financial affairs. I scrolled through the rest without fully reading them, watching the tone escalate from disappointed parent to angry accusations about me being vindictive and ungrateful. The last email threatened to sue me for defamation and false police reports, claiming I'd damaged his reputation and credit by lying to investigators about authorizing the loan. I forwarded all 7 emails to Detective Hensley without responding to any of them, my finger hovering over the reply button for just a second, before I remembered Hensley's advice about documentation. He called me back within an hour and said this was perfect evidence of harassment and showed my father's consciousness of guilt, because innocent people don't typically send threatening emails when accused of fraud. Hensley told me to keep documenting everything, but never engage directly with my father, because any response would encourage more contact and give him the attention he was seeking. He explained that abusers often escalate when they lose control, and my father was following a predictable pattern of trying to intimidate me into backing down. I asked if the emails constituted a crime, and Hensley said they bordered on harassment, but weren't quite severe enough yet for criminal charges, though they would strengthen any future restraining order application. The next morning, I checked my work email and found a message that made my blood run cold. My father had somehow gotten my work email address and sent a message to Charlotte with a subject line that said, "Checking on employee well-being." The message claimed he was my parent who was concerned about my mental health and recent erratic behavior, asking Charlotte to have me contact him about urgent family matters that required immediate attention. I walked straight to Charlotte's office with my phone in hand, and she took one look at my face and closed her door. I showed her the email and explained the situation with the identity theft and harassment, and Charlotte's expression shifted from concern to determination as she picked up her phone. She called Theo Blackwell from HR and asked him to come to her office immediately, then told me the company had protocols for exactly this kind of situation. Theo arrived 5 minutes later carrying a legal pad, and Charlotte forwarded him my father's email while I explained the background. Theo listened carefully and took notes, then said they would document this contact as workplace harassment and send a formal cease and desist letter to my father, stating he was not to contact the company again under any circumstances. He explained that attempting to contact an employee through their workplace email for non-work-related matters after being told to cease contact was a violation of harassment laws, and the company would pursue legal action if my father tried again. I filed the restraining order paperwork on Monday morning, and the judge reviewed it Tuesday afternoon. The clerk called me Wednesday to say it was approved and my father would be served Thursday morning. 48 hours from filing to approval felt incredibly fast, but the attorney explained that cases with documented identity theft and harassment get expedited because they show clear danger patterns. Detective Hensley called me after my father got served and warned me the next few weeks might be rough, because abusers typically escalate when they lose control. He suggested I vary my route to work, check my car before getting in, and keep my phone charged at all times. I thanked him and added 3 more locks to my apartment door that evening. My aunt called me Friday morning sounding exhausted. My mother had been calling her repeatedly asking for my contact information, claiming she just wanted to apologize and explain that my father didn't mean any of it. My aunt told her she wasn't giving out my information under any circumstances, and my mother kept insisting my father was under a lot of stress, and that's why he acted out. My aunt finally snapped and said, "Identity theft isn't something you do by accident when you're stressed. It's a crime you plan and execute deliberately." My mother hung up on her after that, but my aunt wanted me to know they were still trying to find ways to reach me. 2 days later, a new email appeared in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line said, "Please read this from Mom," and my stomach dropped before I even opened it. The message started with apologies about how sorry she was for the graduation dinner and how my father had been wrong to grab my wrist. But by the third paragraph, it shifted completely to asking me to drop the charges and restraining order because I was tearing the family apart. She wrote that my father had been depressed since the restraining order got served. They were struggling to pay for a lawyer, and if I really loved them, I would understand he made mistakes, but didn't deserve criminal consequences. The whole email was designed to make me feel guilty for protecting myself, and I could see the manipulation even through the screen. I printed the email and brought it to my therapy session with Alana that afternoon. She read it carefully, and then helped me identify every manipulation tactic my mother used, minimizing the abuse by calling it mistakes instead of deliberate crimes, blaming me for the consequences of his choices by saying I was tearing the family apart, using guilt about family unity to pressure me into accepting continued harm. Alana pointed out that my mother wasn't apologizing for enabling abuse or for her own participation in attacking me at graduation. She was apologizing that I got upset, which isn't the same thing at all. Alana encouraged me to maintain no contact, because my mother wasn't safe either. She was an active part of the system that hurt me. I didn't respond to the email, but I forwarded it to my attorney and Detective Hensley as documentation. My attorney sent a formal letter to my mother explaining that any further contact attempts violated the spirit of the restraining order, even if she wasn't technically named in it. The letter said if she kept trying to reach me through emails or third parties, she could face legal consequences herself for harassment through proxy. I felt bad for about 5 minutes before remembering that she sat there nodding while my father claimed I destroyed his life, and the guilt disappeared. 4 weeks into the legal process, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. My first reaction was to block it immediately because my parents had been trying to contact me through new numbers. But the message said, "I think I understand now why you left," and "Dad's been doing the same stuff to me," and I realized it was Kyle. I stared at the message for 10 minutes trying to decide if this was genuine or if my parents put him up to it. Kyle had been the golden child who could do no wrong, the planned son who had potential while I was just the unwanted daughter, but something about the message felt real in a way my mother's email hadn't. I responded cautiously, asking what happened. Kyle explained that after I left, my father turned all his controlling attention to Kyle's life choices. When Kyle mentioned he wanted to study music instead of business, my father pulled out a new notebook with calculations about how much Kyle's childhood had cost. My father told Kyle he would only support college if Kyle studied something useful that could pay back the family investment. Kyle sent me a photo of the notebook and my stomach twisted seeing the same obsessive calculations my father had shown me at graduation, except these were about Kyle's expenses instead of mine. Kyle called me that evening and we talked for over an hour. He apologized for recording the graduation dinner and thinking it was funny, admitting he was conditioned to see my father's behavior as normal because it was all he'd ever known. He said watching my father scream at me that night had been entertaining until my father turned the same treatment on him. Now Kyle was starting to recognize the manipulation patterns himself, and he was scared because he didn't have the financial independence I'd built through scholarships and jobs. He'd always assumed my parents would pay for college since they promised they would, but now my father was using that promise as leverage to control his major and his future. I felt torn between wanting to help Kyle and needing to protect myself from potential manipulation. I told him I needed to think about it and talk to my therapist before we continued having regular contact. Kyle said he understood and that he'd wait to hear from me. I brought the situation to Alana the next day, and she helped me work through establishing clear boundaries. I could offer Kyle emotional support and information about resources without becoming financially or legally involved in his situation. I needed to watch for signs that Kyle might be serving as my parents' spy either intentionally or unintentionally, but Alana thought his fear sounded genuine based on what I described. I called Kyle back and told him I would help him with advice and resources, but I couldn't get financially involved or have any contact that included our parents. Kyle agreed immediately and said he wasn't trying to reconcile the family. He just needed someone who understood what he was dealing with. I suggested he look into therapy resources and start documenting everything my father said about money and obligations. I explained how keeping records had helped me recognize the abuse patterns and build my legal case. Kyle admitted he'd been keeping his own journal since my graduation because my father's behavior that night had genuinely scared him. He said he'd been noticing similar patterns in how my father treated him ever since, and now he was documenting it all just like I had. 2 days after my last conversation with Kyle, I woke up to an email notification on my phone that made my stomach drop. The sender was a new address I didn't recognize, but the subject line read, "Can we talk privately?" And I knew before opening it that my mother had found a way around the boundaries I'd set. She wrote that she'd heard from a family friend that I was still in contact with Kyle, which meant someone had been watching his social media or he'd mentioned me to the wrong person. The email started with apologies about how she understood I was hurt and needed space, but quickly shifted into familiar manipulation patterns. She insisted my father loved me in his own way, and his actions came from a place of financial stress and disappointment, not actual malice. She suggested we meet alone without my father present so we could work things out like adults, claiming she wanted to be the bridge that brought our family back together. The final paragraph asked if I could just apologize for filing the police report, and requesting the restraining order, explaining that if I showed good faith by admitting I'd overreacted, my father would be willing to forgive me, and we could all move forward as a family again. I sat on my apartment floor reading the email 3 times, feeling that old familiar guilt trying to creep back in. My mother's version of reconciliation required me to apologize to my abuser for protecting myself from his crimes. She wanted me to admit that identity theft and fraud were overreactions on my part, that I should have just accepted my father stealing $15,000 in my name because family members don't press charges against each other. Her email revealed everything I needed to know about her priorities and where I ranked in her list of concerns. She wasn't worried about my safety or well-being. She wasn't horrified that her husband had committed fraud against their daughter. She was focused entirely on making things comfortable for my father again, on restoring the family dynamic where I was accepted abuse without complaint. Her version of family required me to continue participating in my own victimization, to pretend that criminal behavior was just a misunderstanding between relatives. I didn't respond to the email, but I saved it immediately, forwarding copies to my attorney and adding it to the growing folder of evidence I was keeping. The email demonstrated my mother's continued attempts at manipulation and her fundamental inability to prioritize my safety over my father's comfort. It showed the court and anyone else who needed to see it that my mother was not a safe person either, that she actively enabled and defended my father's abusive behavior. Alana had warned me about this possibility during our sessions, explaining that enablers often try to broker peace that benefits the abuser while putting victims back in harm's way. 5 weeks had passed since I'd filed the initial police report about the identity theft, and I'd fallen into a routine of checking my phone obsessively every time it rang with an unknown number. Detective Hensley called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing engineering specifications at my desk, and I stepped into an empty conference room to take the call. He said the district attorney had reviewed all the evidence and documentation I'd provided, and they were moving forward with formal charges against my father. The case was strong because of the documented loan application with my information, my father's threatening emails that showed clear intent and premeditation, and the established pattern of harassment through multiple channels. They had enough evidence to prove my father had knowingly and deliberately committed identity theft and fraud, and the emails where he'd threatened to make me pay and claimed I owed him money provided motive and consciousness of guilt. Detective Hensley explained they expected to formally charge my father within the next 2 weeks, and I should prepare for the possibility that this might escalate his behavior before it improved. Criminal charges would make everything real and permanent in a way that couldn't be taken back or negotiated away. I thanked him and ended the call, then sat in the empty conference room staring at the wall. Relief washed over me first because someone in authority had looked at the evidence and agreed that what my father did was criminal, not just a family disagreement. The legal system was validating that identity theft didn't become acceptable just because it happened between relatives. But sadness followed immediately after, because this meant my father would face real legal consequences, possibly jail time or probation, and whatever tiny hope I'd been holding on to about him recognizing his behavior and apologizing was completely gone now. I'd spent my entire childhood wanting my father's approval and love, and instead I was the reason he'd have a criminal record. I had a therapy session with Alana scheduled for that evening, and I walked in still processing the phone call from Detective Hensley. Alana listened as I explained the district attorney's decision and the upcoming charges, and she watched my face carefully as I talked about feeling both relieved and sad. She asked me what I was grieving, and I started crying before I could answer, realizing I was mourning the loss of the family I'd always wished I had versus accepting the reality of the family I actually had. I'd spent 22 years hoping my father would suddenly become the parent I needed, that something would click and he'd realize I was worth loving without conditions or payment plans. The criminal charges meant accepting that transformation would never happen, that my father was exactly who he'd always shown himself to be. Alana reminded me that I didn't create the situation through my actions or my existence. My father chose to commit fraud. My father chose to harass me after I escaped. My father chose to escalate rather than respect boundaries. I was simply refusing to continue participating in my own abuse, and that refusal had forced him to face consequences he'd avoided for decades by keeping his behavior within the family. She said grief was normal and healthy because I was letting go of hope for something that was never going to exist, but I needed to remember that protecting myself wasn't betrayal. The family I deserved would never have put me in this position in the first place. 6 weeks after filing for the restraining order, the hearing date arrived and I woke up feeling sick with anxiety. Raymond had offered to attend for support, and he picked me up at my apartment, reminding me during the drive that I had extensive documentation and the truth on my side. The courthouse was busy with multiple hearings scheduled, and I sat on a bench outside the courtroom reviewing my notes and trying to keep my hands from shaking. My attorney arrived and walked me through what would happen, explaining that I'd need to testify about the graduation dinner confrontation, the identity theft, and the ongoing harassment attempts. My father had hired a lawyer who would try to paint him as a concerned parent whose daughter had overreacted, but the judge would review all the physical evidence of fraud and harassment before making a decision. When they called my case, I walked into the courtroom and saw my father sitting at a table with his attorney, and my mother was in the gallery behind him. My father looked angry rather than remorseful, his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on me with obvious hostility. I took the witness stand and swore to tell the truth, then spent 40 minutes recounting the graduation dinner in detail. I described my father's notebooks calculating what I supposedly owed him, his physical grab of my wrist and claim that he owned me, his explicit threats about making me pay back $700,000. I explained the identity theft discovery and the $15,000 loan taken out in my name without my knowledge or consent. I showed the judge copies of my father's threatening emails and documented every attempt he'd made to contact me through work, my apartment manager, and my mother's proxy emails. My father's lawyer tried to suggest I was exaggerating normal parent-child conflict, but my attorney presented the loan documents and fraud investigation results that proved criminal behavior beyond family disagreement. The judge reviewed everything carefully, reading through emails and financial documents while the courtroom stayed silent. Finally, he looked up and stated clearly that the evidence showed a pattern of financial abuse, identity theft, and harassment that demonstrated clear danger to my safety and well-being. He granted a 3-year restraining order requiring my father to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace, with no contact through any means including third parties. Walking out of the courthouse after the hearing, I felt Raymond's hand on my shoulder guiding me toward the exit. My father and mother were in the hallway near the elevators, and my father turned when he heard our footsteps. The look he gave me was pure hatred, his face twisted with rage and his eyes burning with the same intensity I'd seen at the graduation dinner when he'd grabbed my wrist. My mother stood beside him looking smaller than I remembered, her expression a mixture of sadness and resignation that suggested she knew this was the outcome, but hadn't been able to stop it. A security guard noticed the tension and immediately moved between us, asking if there was a problem. Raymond explained we had just received a restraining order and needed escort to our vehicle. The guard nodded and walked with us to the parking garage, staying between my father's line of sight and us until we reached Raymond's car. Once we were inside with the doors locked, Raymond sat for a moment before starting the engine. He said my father's reaction in the hallway was exactly why the restraining order was necessary. That level of visible hatred suggested someone capable of escalating to physical violence if given the opportunity. We discussed additional safety measures during the drive back to my apartment. Raymond suggested varying my routes to and from work, so I didn't establish predictable patterns, being aware of my surroundings, especially in parking lots, and when entering or leaving buildings and keeping my phone charged and accessible at all times. He gave me his personal cell number and made me promise to call immediately if I saw my father anywhere near me, or felt unsafe for any reason. The restraining order was a legal protection, but it was just a piece of paper, and my father had already demonstrated he didn't respect legal or moral boundaries when it came to controlling me. 2 weeks after the restraining order hearing, Kyle texted me that the district attorney had formally charged my father with identity theft, fraud, and criminal harassment. The charges were official now with a court date scheduled for arraignment in 3 weeks. Kyle said my father was absolutely furious and had been ranting for hours about how I was destroying his life and ruining the family. The irony was so dark it almost made me laugh because those were the exact words my father had used about me at graduation, claiming I destroyed every dream he had by existing. Now he was accusing me of destroying his life by refusing to let him destroy mine, by protecting myself from his criminal behavior and abuse. Kyle sounded scared in his messages, mentioning that my father's anger was spilling over onto everyone in the house, and he was taking out his frustration on Kyle and my mother. I reminded Kyle about the resources I'd sent him for documenting abuse, and suggested he might want to stay with friends as much as possible until he could move out permanently. Kyle said he was counting down the days until graduation and his escape to college, using my situation as a roadmap for his own exit strategy. The credit bureaus finally completed their investigations 7 weeks after I'd first reported the fraud, and Owen helped me review the results. Every fraudulent account and inquiry had been removed from my credit report, wiped clean as if they'd never existed. The $15,000 loan was officially marked as fraud and discharged, meaning I had no legal responsibility for repayment, and the debt wouldn't affect my credit score. Owen walked me through setting up credit monitoring services that would alert me immediately if anyone tried to use my information again, explaining the system would flag any new applications or inquiries within hours. My credit score had actually improved once all the fraudulent items were removed, jumping 40 points because the negative marks were gone and my actual credit history was solid. Owen said this was the best possible outcome from a financial perspective, that my credit was now cleaner than it had been before my father's fraud attempt. I felt lighter leaving Owen's office than I had in months, knowing my financial identity was secure and protected in ways it hadn't been when my father had access to my personal information. 3 months had passed since I'd walked out of that graduation dinner and moved across the country. I was settling into a routine that felt stable and predictable in ways my childhood never had. Work was going well, and I'd been consistently exceeding expectations on my engineering projects, solving complex problems, and contributing valuable ideas during team meetings. Charlotte called me into her office one afternoon and told me she was nominating me for a professional development program that would provide advanced training and mentorship for high-potential employees. The program was competitive, and being nominated was recognition that I had real talent and capability. Charlotte said she'd watched me handle incredibly difficult personal circumstances while maintaining excellent work performance, and that level of resilience and dedication was exactly what the company valued. Getting nominated felt like validation, that I was actually good at something, that my father's claims about me being worthless and his predictions that I'd quit within a year were completely wrong. I had value beyond what I supposedly owed him. I had skills and intelligence that existed independent of his approval or disapproval. Amelia and I had grown close over the past months, moving from coworkers who occasionally had lunch together to genuine friends who texted daily and spent time together outside work. The Duncan family had essentially adopted me into their social circle, inviting me to family dinners at their house and game nights where Raymond and Owen argued good-naturedly about strategy while Diane refereed. I'd never experienced this kind of casual family warmth growing up, where people actually enjoyed spending time together without keeping score of who owed what. One evening after dinner, Diane asked if I'd help her clear the table, and we ended up in the kitchen while the others started a card game in the living room. Diane dried dishes while I washed, and she said quietly that she was proud of how I'd handled an impossible situation. She explained that as a therapist, she'd seen many people stay trapped in abusive family systems because leaving felt too hard or too guilty, but I'd chosen my own safety and well-being even when it meant losing my entire family. Having a maternal figure offer genuine support without conditions or expectations of repayment made something crack inside me. I excused myself to the restaurant bathroom and cried for 10 minutes, overwhelmed by the realization that this was what parental support was supposed to feel like. I came back from that moment in the Duncan kitchen and tried to focus on building the life I actually wanted instead of constantly looking over my shoulder. Kyle started texting me more often, usually late at night when my parents were asleep, and his messages shifted from apologizing for the graduation dinner to asking real questions about surviving their pressure. He told me my father had started making the same calculations about his childhood costs, pulling out spreadsheets during dinner and explaining how much Kyle owed for food, housing, and the basketball camp he'd attended in 8th grade. I maintained careful boundaries in our conversations, offering support without getting pulled back into family drama, and I could tell Kyle was starting to understand why I'd left so completely. He mentioned he'd been looking at music programs at colleges across the country, schools with good scholarships that would let him escape without depending on my father's money. I felt proud of him for learning from my experience and planning his own exit strategy, instead of waiting until graduation day to discover he was trapped. Detective Hensley called one afternoon while I was reviewing engineering drawings at my desk, and I stepped into an empty conference room to take the call. He explained that my father's lawyer had been negotiating with the prosecutor's office, and they'd reached a plea deal that would avoid a trial. My father would plead guilty to identity theft and fraud, receive 2 years probation, perform community service, attend mandatory counseling, and pay full restitution for the fraudulent loan plus court costs. Hensley said this was actually a good outcome because it held my father accountable with a permanent criminal record that would show up on background checks, and make it much harder for him to commit fraud again, while avoiding the stress and uncertainty of a trial that could drag on for months. The plea deal would be finalized in court next month, and I wouldn't have to attend unless I wanted to give a victim impact statement. I thanked him and sat in that conference room for 10 minutes after hanging up, processing the strange mix of relief and disappointment that my father would face real consequences, but not the dramatic courtroom confrontation I'd sometimes imagined. 4 months had passed since the graduation dinner when Charlotte announced the engineering team would be attending a company social event at a bowling alley downtown. I almost declined because social events still made me anxious, but Amelia convinced me to go by promising we could leave early if I felt uncomfortable. The bowling alley was loud and chaotic, filled with coworkers laughing and competing for the worst score, and I found myself actually relaxing as I bowled 3 gutter balls in a row, while Owen made jokes about my engineering degree not including spatial awareness. I laughed genuinely for the first time in weeks, not thinking about restraining orders or credit fraud or my father's hatred, just enjoying the moment with people who liked me without keeping score of what I owed them. Amelia noticed during our drive home and commented that I seemed lighter, less tense in my shoulders and more present in conversations. I realized she was right when I checked my phone before bed and saw Kyle's text asking for advice, and my first reaction wasn't panic or dread, but just normal sibling support. My next therapy session with Alana focused on the complicated feelings I had about my family, particularly the guilt that still surfaced when I thought about my mother. Alana helped me understand that I could grieve the loss of relationships while acknowledging they were never actually healthy, that mourning wasn't the same as wanting to go back, I was grieving the parents I deserved to have, the mother who should have protected me instead of enabling my father's abuse, not the actual people who'd ambushed me at my graduation dinner. She explained that accepting this reality was part of healing rather than betrayal, that I didn't owe loyalty to people who'd never shown me genuine love. We talked about how my father's arrest and plea deal brought up feelings of responsibility, as if I'd caused his consequences by reporting the fraud, and Alana reminded me that he'd caused his own consequences by committing crimes. I left her office feeling less heavy, more certain that the distance I'd created wasn't cruelty, but necessary self-preservation. Kyle called instead of texting one evening while I was making dinner, and I almost didn't answer because phone calls felt more dangerous than messages I could control. His voice was excited when I picked up, talking fast about acceptance letters and scholarship offers, explaining he'd gotten into a music program across the country with enough financial aid to cover tuition and housing. He was planning to move out right after high school graduation in 2 months, and he wanted advice about the transition since I'd done it 6 months earlier. I shared practical information about building credit by getting a secured card, setting up a budget that tracked every dollar, and creating physical distance before announcing his plans so my parents couldn't sabotage his escape. Kyle asked specific questions about opening bank accounts they couldn't access and changing his phone number without them finding out, and I realized he was taking this seriously, instead of just fantasizing about leaving. I felt genuinely good being able to help him avoid some of the isolation and fear I'd experienced, knowing he'd have support I didn't have when I'd fled to this city alone. 5 months into my new life, Charlotte called me into her office on a Friday afternoon, and my immediate reaction was panic that something had gone wrong. Instead, she told me she was promoting me to project lead on a major client account, citing my excellent work and leadership potential during team meetings. The promotion came with a significant raise that would let me move to a better apartment and actually save money instead of living paycheck to paycheck. I sat in Charlotte's office trying to process that I was recognized for my skills and contributions, that my value was real and measurable beyond my father's delusional debt calculations. She mentioned the company saw long-term potential in me and wanted to invest in my professional development, which directly contradicted my father's prediction that I'd quit within a year to become a housewife. That evening, I opened a savings account at a different bank than my checking account, one that existed entirely in my name with security questions only I knew the answers to. And watching the first deposit appear felt like reclaiming ownership of my own financial future. The plea deal hearing happened on a Tuesday morning, and Detective Hensley called afterward to tell me the judge had accepted the agreement. My father was officially sentenced to 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, mandatory counseling sessions twice a month, and ordered to pay $15,000 in restitution for the fraudulent loan plus $3,000 in court costs. The judge had apparently made a point of stating that financial abuse of family members was a serious crime, and the court wouldn't tolerate parents exploiting their children for money, which Hensley said was unusual, and showed the judge understood the full context of the case. My father now had a permanent criminal record that would appear on any background check, making it harder for him to get certain jobs or loans or pass security clearances. I thanked Hensley for everything he'd done, and after hanging up, I sat at my desk feeling validated in a way I hadn't expected, knowing a judge had explicitly said what my father did was wrong and unacceptable. I spent several days thinking about my relationship with Kyle and what boundaries made sense going forward. I decided I could maintain limited contact with him while keeping permanent separation from my parents, and I called him to explain that I was available for support, but couldn't have any communication that involved them, or passed information between us. Kyle understood immediately and said he was planning similar boundaries once he moved out, that he'd already started gray-rocking my parents by giving minimal responses and avoiding topics they could use against him. We agreed to build our own sibling relationship separate from our parents' dysfunction, one based on actual care instead of obligation or competition. He promised not to share any details about my life with them, and I believed him because he'd kept our conversations private for months, despite my father's attempts to get information. 6 months after walking away from that graduation dinner, I was living a life I'd never imagined possible during those dark years of believing I owed my father everything. I had a career I genuinely loved, solving complex engineering problems and leading projects that mattered. I had friends who supported me without keeping score. People like Amelia and her family who included me in their lives because they wanted to, not because they expected repayment. I had therapy with Alana that was helping me understand myself and heal from decades of manipulation. I had legal protections in place that kept me safe from further abuse, a restraining order and criminal record that meant my father couldn't easily reach me. The constant anxiety that had defined my first weeks here had faded to occasional moments of hypervigilance, and I was sleeping through most nights without checking the locks obsessively. I still had hard days when I grieved the family I deserved, but more often I felt grateful for the life I was building on my own terms. Amelia and I had been talking about getting a bigger place together, and we spent weekends looking at 2-bedroom apartments in neighborhoods we couldn't afford alone. We found one near a park with hardwood floors and a kitchen that actually had counter space, nicer than either of our current apartments and cheaper per person than what we were each paying. Having a roommate I trusted completely felt like reclaiming something my father had violated when he'd stolen my identity and invaded my financial privacy. We signed the lease on a Saturday afternoon, and that evening the Duncan family came over to our current apartment to celebrate. Raymond raised his glass of wine and toasted to chosen family and new beginnings, to building lives defined by love instead of obligation. Diane hugged me and said she was proud of how far I'd come, and Owen joked that he'd help us move if we bought pizza and beer. I looked around at these people who'd become my family by choice, who supported me without expecting repayment or keeping notebooks of my costs, and I felt genuinely happy in a way I'd never experienced in my parents' house. The restraining order paperwork sat in my filing cabinet next to the fraud resolution letters and credit monitoring reports, each document a piece of proof that I'd protected myself correctly. Detective Hensley called one afternoon 3 weeks after my father's sentencing to officially close the case, and his voice carried the kind of tired satisfaction that comes from actually helping someone. He said I'd done everything right from the first police report through the court proceedings, that most victims don't document as thoroughly or act as quickly, and hearing those words from someone who'd spent 20 years in law enforcement made something settle in my chest. The small voice that still whispered, "Maybe you overreacted," or "Maybe you should have tried harder with family," finally went quiet when a detective who'd seen hundreds of abuse cases told me I'd handled mine exactly right. My credit report showed 0 fraudulent accounts, all 3 bureaus had permanent fraud alerts, and Owen had set up monitoring that would notify me within hours if anyone tried using my information again. My father's criminal record meant banks would scrutinize any application more carefully, and the restitution order meant he was paying back the $15,000 plus court costs at $75 per month for the next several years. A constant reminder of what happened when he tried to control me through fraud. Kyle's graduation photos arrived via text message on a Saturday morning in June, showing his dorm room with band posters already covering the walls and his guitar propped in the corner. He'd moved straight from the ceremony to campus, skipping any celebration with our parents, and his message said, "Thank you for showing me I could actually leave." Apparently, our parents had shown up at his high school graduation despite Kyle telling them not to come. And my father had tried the same performance he'd done at mine, standing up during the ceremony to announce that Kyle was abandoning the family after everything they'd sacrificed. But Kyle had warned school security ahead of time, given them photos and descriptions, and when my father started his speech, 2 security officers escorted both parents out of the auditorium before Kyle even walked across the stage. Kyle's next text was a photo of the security officers standing by the exit doors, and he'd written they didn't even make it to the restaurant this time, which made me incredibly proud of his preparation and strength. He was building his own escape with the advantage of watching mine first, learning from my mistakes and my successes, and knowing he wasn't alone in recognizing our parents' dysfunction. My therapy sessions with Alana had shifted from crisis management to actual healing work, exploring how to build healthy relationships when your blueprint for family was completely broken. She helped me understand that healing wasn't a straight line from broken to fixed, that I'd have good weeks and terrible days, progress and setbacks, moments of confidence and moments of doubt. We worked on recognizing red flags in new relationships, identifying when someone was trying to manipulate or control me versus offering genuine support, and I was learning the difference between people who gave freely and people who kept score. Alana said I'd made remarkable progress in 8 months, that most people took years to establish the kind of boundaries and self-protection I'd built, and while I still struggled with guilt sometimes, I was learning to recognize it as programming rather than truth. The hardest work was accepting that my worth existed independent of my father's calculations and my mother's conditional approval, that I had value simply by existing, rather than by what I produced or provided or paid back. 8 months after walking out of that graduation dinner, I woke up in the apartment I shared with Amelia and felt genuinely happy in a way I'd never experienced in my parents' house. I had a career I loved where Charlotte had just promoted me to senior engineer, friends who included me in their lives, because they wanted my company, not my money, therapy that was helping me build a future instead of just surviving my past, and legal protections that kept me safe from further abuse. The Duncan family had adopted me into their holiday plans, Raymond and Diane treating me like a daughter they'd chosen rather than one they were stuck with, and Owen joked that he'd gained a sister who actually appreciated his credit expertise. I still had hard days when I scrolled past a photo that reminded me of childhood moments, when I grieved the parents I deserved instead of the ones I got, times when I wondered if I could have done something differently to make them love me correctly. But those moments were becoming less frequent and less devastating, replaced by days where I felt proud of the life I was building through my own choices rather than my father's control. The freedom to make my own decisions, spend my own money, live in my own space, and choose my own family was worth every difficult conversation, every legal battle, every moment of doubt I'd gone through to achieve it.